Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This video is a follow-up response to the Christian apologist Al-Finlandi, whom some of you may know from Twitter. I had a recent discussion with him on Twitter about the book of Daniel. To summarize, my contention was that Daniel 11 and Daniel 12 contain a false prophecy about the Greek Seleucid king Antiochus IV, who called himself Epiphanes, or God Manifest. Of course, Al-Finlandi disputed this and asserted that there was no false prophecy, and his main argument rested on verse 31, which according to the Hellenic Jewish translator Theodotion's version, states that the seed or offspring of Antiochus would desecrate the Jewish temple. Historically, we know that it was indeed Antiochus and his army that installed a pagan altar in the temple, and the Masoretic text and most of the Greek translations of verse 31 state that Antiochus's army would attack and desecrate the temple. Notice the word here is arms. Figuratively, it means military forces or army. But since his Orthodox Church considers Theodotion's version to be more authoritative, Al-Finlandi argues that Daniel 11:31 is not about Antiochus, but rather his seed or offspring, which he claims may refer to the future coming of the Antichrist, or the man of lawlessness. And indeed, when we compare the Masoretic version to Theodotion's version, there is a difference. While the Masoretic text uses the Hebrew word zeroah, which means arms, literally, but figuratively it means military forces or army, Theodotion's translation uses the Greek word spermata. Now, as I had already explained to Al-Finlandi in the conversation, the Greek reading could simply be a mistake. I had cited the Werner Bible commentary, which states, instead of a rendering of the Hebrew word for arms, the version of Theodotion contains the word seeds or progeny. This is because the consonants for the Hebrew words are identical. And indeed, I confirmed this upon further research. Other Christian scholars are of the same view. For example, the Pulpit Commentary states that Theodotion's translation is based on a mistaken vocalization. Another Muslim brother, Brother Muhammad, had already made this point as well on Twitter to Al-Finlandi, but Al-Finlandi simply brushed it away, stating that he still preferred Theodotion's translation because that is what his church adopted. Apparently, it didn't dawn on Al-Finlandi that his church's preference could still be mistaken. It could be a simple mistake. I had also pointed out that even if we prefer Theodotion's version, it cannot be referring to a future Antichrist because the Greek word spermata is a plural word, not singular. So it cannot refer to a single man unless there would be multiple Antichrists who would desecrate the temple simultaneously, which is of course ridiculous. Al-Finlandi also brushed this aside without any reasonable rebuttal. Now let us see if some new information will convince Al-Finlandi to admit that his view is mistaken. Coming back to the Masoretic text, as I mentioned before, the Hebrew word used is zeroah, which according to Gesenius' Hebrew Chaldee lexicon, figuratively means strength, might, or power, as well as military force or an army. Notice that it cites Daniel 11:31, but also verse 15 and 22. So let's look at verse 22. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him, both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. Notice that it is the same word with a slight difference in spelling. Now, we should expect Theodotion's Greek translation to use the word sperma in some form for verses 15 and 22. Therefore, the English reading would be, instead of forces of the south will be powerless to resist, or then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him, it should say seed. So the seed of the south will be powerless to resist, or then an overwhelming seed will be swept away before him. Obviously, this does not make any sense. However, this is not the case with Theodotion's translation. It uses the Greek word brachion in verses 15 and 22, which, like the Hebrew word zeroah, figuratively means strength or arm, and therefore could mean the military forces of Antiochus. Thus, the English translation of Theodotion's Greek version, verses 15 and 22, uses the word arms, as in military strength. And the arms of the king of the south shall withstand, and the arms of him that overflows shall be washed away. This is referring to military forces. So it's not saying seed. Therefore, Theodotion's Greek is clearly inconsistent. Before Al-Finlandi counters that the spelling of the words in verses 15 and 22 compared to verse 31 is different, let me cite the Kiel and Delitzsch Old Testament commentary on verse 31, which states that the Hebrew word means warlike forces, as Daniel 11:15 and Daniel 11:22. For verse 31, it cites verses 15 and 22 as well. And then it states that the plural has here the masculine form, while in those verses, meaning verses 15 and 22, it has the feminine form, furnishes no reason for a difference of meaning. So in other words, in all three verses, the meaning is the same, warlike forces. There are other problems with Al-Finlandi's argument. He agreed that Daniel 11 verse 30 was about Antiochus. Now, if he still prefers Theodotion's version, it still does not save him from dealing with false prophecies. The reason is that verse 36 states that he shall do according to his will. Well, who is the he? Notice that verse 30, which Al-Finlandi admits is about Antiochus, refers to the same he. He shall be brought low. Then it talks about his seed desecrating the temple, and then verse 36 comes back to the he. So it's obvious that verse 36 is talking about Antiochus. If we continue reading, verses 42 and 44 still contain false prophecies about Antiochus. After his failed invasion of Egypt, or the Ptolemaic Empire, when the Romans intervened, Antiochus, according to verse 42, would attempt another invasion, and this time would conquer Egypt. See, it says, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But this did not happen. Historically, we know that Antiochus did not attempt another invasion of Egypt because clearly the Romans were protecting it. They had an interest in Egypt. Also, verse 44 states that Antiochus will die near the Holy Land. It mentions the Holy Mountain of Beauty. This is referring to somewhere near the Holy Land. But historically, we know that he died in Persia. Note that Al-Finlandi had contended that verses 36 to 45 were not about Antiochus. But contextually, we see that it is. That's undeniable, since verse 36 clearly talks about the same person as in verse 30. It has to be about Antiochus. He did exalt himself as the title Epiphanes demonstrates, and he did honor the god of forces, which most scholars agree was Jupiter Capitolinus, the Roman version of the Greek god Zeus. Al-Finlandi contended that as Greek king, Antiochus and his ancestors would have known who Zeus was, but verse 38 states that the god Antiochus will honor was not known to his fathers, and a god whom his fathers knew not, he shall honor. But this is not a major problem, and it can be explained. As the Christian commentator Albert Barnes noted in his commentary, when in Rome, where Antiochus spent his early years, he had learned to worship the Jupiter of the capital, and that he endeavored to introduce the worship of that foreign god into Syria. Why would Antiochus have learned about Jupiter Capitolinus if, as a Greek man, he would have been familiar with Zeus? Also, though there were many similarities between Zeus and Jupiter, most of which were adapted from Greek myths, there were some differences. For example, unlike Zeus, Jupiter Capitolinus was politically linked only to Rome. So Mythopedia.com states, unlike Zeus, Jupiter was explicitly linked to a specific political entity, Rome. He was the principal god of Rome. The Romans simply adapted many of the Greek myths about Zeus and applied them to Jupiter. So verse 38 does not prove that the prophecy is about someone else other than Antiochus. Further proof that Jupiter Capitolinus and Zeus were, despite similarities, originally were considered to be separate deities can be seen in the following. In the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Andrew Hill states, the god whom this boastful king, Antiochus, honors is a god of fortresses. Several suggestions have been made identifying this god, with one of the numerous fortresses established by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The god Jupiter Capitolinus, to whom Antiochus erected a great statue at Antioch. The god Zeus, based on an inscription found at Scythopolis. Notice here that they're clearly considered to be separate deities, Jupiter Capitolinus and Zeus. The bottom line is that the Roman gods were originally different from the Greek gods. Later on, they were considered the same, and that was because the Romans adapted the Greek myths. Finally, Daniel 12 states that after the death of Antiochus, there will be more tribulation, until finally the resurrection of the dead will occur. Verse 2 states, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to reproach and everlasting shame." But of course, none of this happened. Life went on as usual. It is also a false prophecy. So none of this stuff in Daniel 12 came true. In conclusion, I think I have shown very conclusively that Theodotion's reading of verse 31 was incorrect, and that there definitely were many false prophecies in Daniel chapter 11 and also in Daniel chapter 12. Hopefully, Al-Finlandi will look at this objectively and not let his Christian bias determine that the opposite is true. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وقل جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا